group of peers and maybe you find a mate.
Right.
And especially the last one,
Right.
if that's your $200,000 investment and you have pooled around you eligible young people of a certain degree of, let's say, intellectual capability and discipline, somewhat selected, that's not such a bad deal.
No.
That's not exactly the fundamental purpose of an educational institution, but it's not trivial and it's not easy to replace.
No, and I think that's why that's why the game's continuing to go.
Yes,
So we're going to have to find a way to replace that, or it's going to continue to be, in essence, a very expensive country club.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very expensive country club, and
now it's a very
speed
expensive
dating.
country cult.
Yes.
So and that's definitely a problem.
And I think my friends that are in higher ed and that are thoughtful have seen this coming. The other issue that higher ed faces is, as you well know, they make all their money on the freshmen and sophomores teaching them with adjuncts.
Yes, right.
And so then the upper division courses are very expensive, taught by tenured faculty.
Right.
But it's the internet that's threatening. It's all the distance learning is threatening the freshman and sophomore group. But if they lose enough of that group or have to discount, then the whole model turns upside down, and higher ed has no way to cut cost.
Yeah,
they can't because they can't cut costs. So.
Also, let's talk about cost. So we were talking last night. You said in Austin, it's $32,000 a year per student. That's the public education cost.
Right, for K-12.
But that's also that's an underestimate. So let's
So my belief and what I've seen is that doesn't include all the facility cost properly accounted for.
Right.
So the number's somewhere north of 32,000 last saw, and that ranges from 20,000 around the country to much more than that. And you were going to ask, I think you were saying cost at Acton Academy. We've got some incredibly successful campuses that now are running at anywhere from $1,000 per student per year to maybe $2,500 per student per year. Now we have some that have tuition as high as $35,000 a year. So it varies.
Yeah.
But we're managing, by the fact these young people are so super capable on their own, we're managing to create alternatives that deliver extraordinary, both academic
and so that's 5% of the cost,
Yeah.
fundamentally. Well, and let's delve into those numbers a little bit.
Yep.
I mean, a pretty decent teacher's salary is $60,000. I don't think that's unfair.
Right.
Okay. So that means each two students could, in principle, hire a teacher just for them. Now, maybe you could double that if you had to include the cost of a building, because generally, the infrastructure costs in the typical organization are about equivalent to the staffing costs, if you need a rule of thumb.
Yeah.
And so that means that, in principle, what the education system is spending now would allow each group of 4 students to hire a full-time teacher.
Yes.
Right. And so this is not an efficient system, obviously.
Well, and if you look at the head count, and this is true for all bureaucracies, by the way, not just public education, but it's about a 5-to-1 adult to learner to student ratio. Now, it's not 5-to-1 per teacher, but there's so many admin people.
5-to-1 per student.
Yeah, there's 1 adult for every 5 students.
Right.
That's the across, and our rate is more like 1 adult for every 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 students.
Right, and that's so interesting too, because one of the claims that's constantly put forward by teachers' unions in particular is that, well, the only thing that really matters in education is teacher to student ratio. Right. There should be more, there shouldn't be more than 10 students per teacher.
Right.
And you can understand that to some degree if you believe that teacher attention to a given student is a marker for academic movement forward. But your model is more the idea that, no, if the institution is well constituted, then you produce maximal autonomy on the part of the participants, and while they pick up the work, they do the learning that goes along with picking up the work.
Right, well, and the thing I say is fundamental is, education is not the same as learning. Education is something you do to someone. You educate them. Now, you can self-educate, but if you're educating someone, learning is what the person experiences.
Right, it's like the delivery of a product.
Right, and so I want to be careful here, because our model is just one model. There's going to be 50 fun models and interesting models come out for learning as the world changes. And, my great-grandfather was president of a university. He's buried on their campus. I mean, I came from my wife's mother, Joanna, was one of the incredible teachers in Oklahoma City. In fact, a quick story that's worth telling about that. we're having one of these exhibitions I talked about. And this woman comes up to me, and we're in Austin, Texas, and she comes up and she said, you know, this reminds me of my 8th grade science teacher. And she said, I live in Oklahoma City. I came to see this, and it reminds me of her. And she started describing this wonderful teacher who was Socratic and who did all the things. And she said, she got finished, and I said, and her name was Joanna Anderson.
Oh.
And the lady said, how in the world could you have known that? And I said, because that's her daughter, Laura. And the woman just started crying. And she said, that lady changed my life.
Right,
so adults have an important role to play in a child's life.
Yeah.
That role shouldn't be to be an authoritarian, you know, having order to sit at a desk where a bell rings every 45 minutes.
Yeah.
That's not the teacher's fault. That's the system, right? It's the system. Now, you're participating in the system.
Yeah.
But I always try to, I try to divide. The teachers are often the heroes, and sometimes not. The system's the problem. And I don't think there's anyone that doesn't think the system is broken. There are going to be a lot of different recipes. We've got a recipe that happens to be very low cost and seems to be powerful, and it's a work in progress.
Also scalable.
And scalable.
Which is
We have one employee, and our whole network, our staff is one.
One employee.
For 300 campuses.
How
Because
do you facilitate communication between the campuses and exchange,
Yep.
let's say, best practices?
there's a forum where people are exchanging. Since we've been sitting here, we've probably gotten 4 new experiments on the forum. When I get off, I'll read them.
Oh, yeah,
So
okay.
people are, and so there's a way, it's like Legos. There's a way to share experiments.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's a way to report on them. There's a central place. It's almost like Unix code to store. And we've been very careful how the modules fit together so they're defined so you can swap out modules. And so people are running all across the world.
You have areas that you're, we just touched upon this a little bit last night. You have domains, is that the right way of thinking about them? Like domains of learning? How do you structure the...
Yeah, so you would think about the typical reading, writing, math. I mean, there's ways to do that. But what we have are these 6-week quests. And you might do for biology the medical quest we talked about where you're diagnosing disease. We have a great quest on living well and dying well. It's all about death. And so those quests last for 6 weeks. They're integrative, and they'll teach you something about life, personal finance, biology, but applied chemistry, things you're going to really do. And then you have genres, which are much like your essay product, except they're different recipes for writing a white paper, a poem. And so you're actually practicing something you're going to write and use in the real world and display in front of an audience. It might be a speech. So those chunks are well-defined, and you could create one, I could create one, we can present it to the crowd, and the crowd votes them up.
Right.
And then that's shared among the group, and it becomes the standard until something replaces it.
Right. How do you stop, or how have you dealt with the problem of ideological capture, let's say, on whatever side of the political spectrum?
Well, I think we're agnostic. I mean, we have a series of promises, like we believe that economic freedom, religious freedom, and political freedom, are one of our core beliefs.
Right, so that's non-negotiable.
Right, so that's not negotiable. So there's a series of things like that. We believe every child's a genius who is destined to change the world. So there are a set of those you agree to. And everything else is up for fair debate. If you can make and we've had...
Right, so you have a limited number of
I
core
had committed
principles.
communists, in my group of high schoolers that would debate why Marx was right. And it's fascinating to listen to them. In fact, there were times I was like, that's a pretty dadgum good point. I'm a committed capitalist. It's like, that's market failure. That's an interest. So everything's up for debate. Nothing is up for not saying something about the truth, and it's all to be tested. So there is no ideological capture from the left or right when you have to actually test things in the real world and debate them. And can you be wrong? Of course you can.
And has the spread of, let's say, woke culture, to use a somewhat awkward phrase, has that produced a challenge to the operation of your institutions, or are people just sidestepping that problem altogether within the confines of your organization?
Well, so if you came from, let's just say you came from one of the protected woke classes that people talk about. If you want to be gay, I'm going to be tolerant of that. That's not, I mean, that's your choice, right? I'm not going to, now we could talk about the impacts that's going to have or what it's about means, but it's just an honest conversation. And so,
Right. Well, though people who are different in their proclivity, like temperamentally or sexually, let's say, are still going to have to contend with the fact that they have to integrate that within a community.
Difference is good. Now you stand up and say, I'm a victim.
Yeah, right.
And it's like, well, okay, well, why are you a victim? Well, let's explore that, because victims aren't okay here. So what are you going to do about it? Well, I'm going to post on Instagram. It's like, well, what else might you do besides that? I really care about this. I'm going to post twice on Instagram.
Well, the problem with the victim narrative isn't so much the observation that unfair things happen to people, and sometimes even systematically. It's like, for sure, that's the case. The issue is, do you remove from yourself all sense of agency and competent power by construing yourself as the tragic victim of like hyper powerful and irresistible forces? And if the answer to that is yes, all my agency is removed, then the victim narrative is actually what's victimizing you.
Right. And so if you said life's unfair, the answer would be, of course it is. What are you going to do about it? If you're not willing to do something about it personally, then it must not be that big an issue.
Well, it's also the case that life is unfair in weird ways. I mean, one of the things that the Marxist types, for example, point to is the fact that, well, wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, and that tends to be the case. And they tend to be older. It's like, yeah, okay, older people. One of the best predictors of wealth is age.
Right.
So, but then you think, well, wait a second. Are we really so upset about that? First of all, it isn't obvious to me at all that, like, the